going to say something controversial, but hear me out. Just hear me out. Your pain, it's not that interesting. Let me explain. If I took all the humans in the world, I could group them into relatively small categories in terms of suffering. If we stripped away the personal details, human suffering tends to fall into just a handful of broad, reoccurring categories. In fact, human suffering can be understood through four broad dimensions. First, we have the body, right, which endures physical pain, illness, injury, aging, and just the inherent limitations of the earthling organism itself. Then there's the mind, which wrestles with psychological distress such as fear, anxiety, depression, grief, trauma, and the restless grasping of thought. Then we have society, where relational and collective suffering emerges in the form of conflict, loneliness, injustice, oppression, poverty, and displacement. And we can't forget the spirit, which confronts existential and spiritual struggles, questionings of meaning, mortality, identity, faith, and the profound sense of separation from the divine. That's a big one. Together, these categories form a universal framework that encompasses the many ways human beings experience and interpret suffering. My pain, your pain, our pain is not that unique, nor is it that interesting. What becomes an interesting story is not the pain itself, but the transformation that follows when pain is no longer a dead end, but a passage, a pathway. When suffering is not merely endured, but consciously worked with. When someone enters the depths of their own experience and return not unmarked, but integrated, not erased, not transcended, but metabolized into something that can support life. Now, that's when the pain story becomes really interesting. What makes the difference isn't whether pain exists, it does, but rather how the pain is met. Some people are engulfed by suffering and never find meaning within it. Others address it partially, healing in certain areas of life while remaining unconscious or unable to let go of a lot of it. And some never even recognize it at all, living inside patterns they believe are simply who they are and how they were built. So the question is not whether suffering is universal, it is, but how we relate to it. The ancient world sought liberation through gnosis, right? Knowledge, gnosis. The medieval world sought transformation through process, through personal alchemy. And the modern world, well, the modern world is split in two. Half are seeking liberation and transformation through categorization and control. The other half, though, is seeking it through mind-based spirituality. My work lives in the space between where these three meet, and that space changes how suffering is experienced entirely. Because the real question isn't how we label pain or whether pain exists, it does. The real question is what pain becomes when it's met consciously, embodied fully, and allowed to transform rather than be managed or avoided. As a recovering feel-good junkie, I have become an expert on this topic. And if you're new here, my name is Erica, and I've spent years studying ancient texts, forgotten wisdom, and the way nature teaches us how to live in harmony. And in this episode, I'm going to explore what ancient wisdom, medieval alchemy, and modern understanding each got right, where they fall short, and what becomes possible when we learn to integrate all three. I'll share how I've worked with each of these lenses in my own life, along with practical ways you can apply them in your own life, building a bridge between ancient insight and modern experience. This episode is for anyone who wants their pain to become a pathway to a new life, not just a symptom to manage. If that's you, stay with me. If we start with the ancient world, we see that suffering was not primarily approached as a pathology like it largely is today. It was approached as a question of identity. In traditions like Hermeticism, early mysticism, including Christian mysticism, and other non dual teachings, liberation came through gnosis, direct knowing. Not belief, not one doctrine or moral obedience, but lived recognition that who you are is not reducible to the contents of your experience. When this shift occurred, suffering did not necessarily disappear, but it lost its power to define the totality of one's experience. There was a larger context holding it, right? To know was to awaken from forgetfulness and remember oneself as more than the body, more than fate, more than the material world. So, how can we apply this practically today? Gnosis asks deceptively simple but radical questions. Who are you beneath the story of suffering? Not who you are as a body in pain, not who you are as a mind shaped by fear, anxiety, and depression, but who is the one that is aware of the pain, fear, and story in the first place? Who are you when everything that hurts is stripped away? If you want to work with this ancient lens, answer those questions. I had to answer those questions. Can you answer those questions? Suffering in the ancient world was not denied, but it was not given the full or final authority either. Pain was seen as something that can obscure truth, but also something that could point beyond itself. But knowledge alone has its limits. Knowing something does not automatically change a nervous system conditioned by fear, trauma, or chronic stress. And this is where the ancient world, for all its depth, often left people, especially those with loud physical symptoms, without a map for how transformation, unfolds over time. This brings us to the medieval world, where suffering was no longer treated primarily as an illusion of identity, but as material for transformation. By the medieval period, we see the rise and dominance in the Christian church, where consciousness was no longer oriented primarily towards cosmic remembrance, but toward matter, labor, sin, and redemption. People experience themselves as fallen and fragmented and bound to dense material conditions. The question became less, who am I in the cosmos, and more, how can what is broken or impure be transformed? Alchemy rose as a symbolic and practical language for this need for interchange. It recognized that suffering had weight, it had density, texture, and that it could not be simply thought away. Alchemy understood transformation as slow, cyclical, and embodied. Heat had to be applied, pressure had to be endured, things had to break down before they could reemerge, right? In this worldview, suffering was not a mistake, it was the raw material, the very thing that, when stayed with, could be refined into something else. I used to live in high levels of pain and suffering. There are many alchemical practices I engaged in to learn how to endure the pressure that comes with transformation. One of those practices I did was pendulation, which you can learn more about in my YouTube episode titled The Hidden Trap of Self-Awareness. Pendulation is the practice of moving attention back and forth between a place of activation, like tension, fear, and discomfort, and then to a place of either safety or neutrality. It allows one to touch the pain, the pressure, to turn up the heat while knowing one can easily come back to safety. This is one of the most direct modern ways to practice the medieval alchemical principle of transformation. What alchemy understood intuitively is something modern trauma work is kind of rediscovering. The change happens through repeated contact, not sudden insight, through allowing experience to move, metabolize, and reorganize. Still, alchemy speaks in symbols with a heavy focus on material impurity and moral transformation. For many people, that language was hard to grasp or only addressed part of the picture, which brings us to the modern world. The modern world focuses on the psychological turn that emerged as religion lost its unquestioned authority and science reframed reality as mechanical and objective. In the modern era, the problem is no longer framed as cosmic ignorance or material impurity, but as mental suffering. So, anxiety, depression, alienation, meaninglessness, it's mental suffering. Today's suffering is often approached through categorization and control. Pain is named, symptoms are labeled, experiences are diagnosed, and then they are treated through medication, cognitive strategies, or behavioral modification. These approaches are not inherently wrong. They can definitely be stabilizing. They can save lives. They can create space, but they often stop at management. The people I know who live inside this lens can function better for sure. But they also seem frozen, caught in kind of a suspended animation where transformation is limited because of maintenance. The modern world asks, how do we reduce this symptom? How do we get them to function better? How do we get them to cope? What is rarely asked is, what is this suffering trying to transform? What is it trying to become? Over the last 5 or 6 years, though, something interesting has happened. Modern suffering has split. One group has stayed on the path of diagnosis, management, and control, trusting the medical, neurochemical explanation and the evidence based protocol. But the other group has moved towards something else entirely, mind based spirituality. This includes mentalism, new thought, manifestation teachings, and non dual frameworks. It's the turn towards the idea that the mind is not just a processor of experience, but the primary shaper of reality itself. This shift did not come out of nowhere. It has deep roots in texts like the Kabbalion, which teaches the principle of mentalism, the all is mind, and frames reality as fundamentally shaped by consciousness. We see this in the New Thought teachings or the biology of belief movement, like the work of Louis Hay and Dr. Bruce Lipton, where belief, imagination, and assumption are treated as creative forces. And you can learn more about Dr. Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief in my YouTube episode titled Who Controls Your Life? This shift also shows up in the law of attraction literature, and it appears in non dual teachings like A Course in Miracles, which frames suffering as a perceptual error, something arising from misidentification with the ego rather than from the world itself. And to learn more about A Course in Miracles, you can watch my episode titled Please Take Notes. For many people, these frameworks feel like a lifeline. They offer something the clinical model often doesn't, a sense of agency, meaning, and participation. Instead of being told your brain chemistry is malfunctioning, they're told your consciousness is powerful. Instead of manage your symptoms, they hear your perception shapes your experience. Instead of cope, they hear create. For a nervous system that feels powerless, this brings in power. This turn towards mind based spirituality also has its shadows. When taken literally, mentalism can collapse into self blame. If everything is mine, then every painful experience becomes your fault. New thought can become hyper individualistic, ignoring trauma, context, and systemic forces. Non dual teachings can become dissociative, encouraging people to bypass the body in favor of abstract awareness. And manifestation culture can create quiet shame. If your life hasn't changed, you must not be aligned enough, high vibe enough, or spiritually advanced enough. Still, the reason this other half is growing is because many people are hungry for something deeper than symptom management. They want suffering to be more than a just physical malfunction. They want it to be meaningful and transformative. This is the landscape we're living in now. One half of the modern world treating suffering as a problem to be controlled, and the other half treating suffering as a message, a mirror, or a manifestation. Both are trying to make sense of the same pain. Both are incomplete on their own. When we integrate these three lenses, something powerful happens. From the ancient world, we learn that suffering loosens when identity shifts, when awareness recognizes itself as more than what it is experiencing. From the medieval world, we learn that transformation takes time, that suffering must be stayed with, not bypassed, in order to change form. From the modern world, we learn how this actually happens in the body, in perception, in the nervous system through evidence. Integration is not about choosing one framework over another, it's about allowing each to do the work it is best suited for. Insight without embodiment becomes spiritual bypassing, right? And processed without awareness becomes endless struggle. Management without meaning becomes quiet despair. But when awareness, embodiment, and evidence meet, suffering begins to behave differently. And that is the story I want to hear. Have a good week.